In the January of 1846, in a trapping camp at the base of the Absaroka Range in the Montana Territory, 9 men dug into a hillside and built themselves a shelter. They cut pine poles for the frame. They packed sod and frozen mud against the walls. They stuffed moss and dried grass into every crack until the wind stopped whispering through. They hung a buffalo hide over the door and weighted it with stones. Then they built a fire inside and lay down in their blankets to wait out the blizzard. The fire crackled. The walls held. The wind howled outside, and not a breath of it reached them. By the 3rd morning, 7 of those 9 men were dead. Not one of them froze in the open. Not one of them was caught in the storm. They died inside. In the shelter they built to save them. The blizzard got the story. The shelter got the praise. But it was not the blizzard that killed frontier men, friend. It was a myth. The myth said, if you seal every crack, block every draft, and stop the wind from reaching you, you survive the cold. That myth buried more men than every blizzard that ever blew across the northern plains. Here is the twist. The shelter was not the enemy. What they left out of it was. What those trappers were trying to build has a name. It is called a field shelter. Not the kind you buy at a camping store in a stuff sack with fiberglass poles and a rainfly. The kind your great-great-grandfather built with his hands, from whatever the ground gave him in the hour before dark. The way a frontier family survived a 3-day whiteout with no cabin, no stove, no supply wagon, and no rescue coming. And I am going to walk you through every piece of it, the way it was actually built by the people who lived through winters that would kill most modern men in a night. Every piece except one. If a winter storm knocked out your heat tonight, and the temperature dropped to 10 below by morning, could you keep your family warm without electricity, without gas, without driving to a shelter? Most grown adults in this country could not survive 48 hours. Their great-grandfathers slept through worse in structures they built in an afternoon with an axe, a knife, and the trees around them. That is the sovereignty we are taking back today. The ability to shelter your own family through any cold, on any ground, without asking a company or a county for heat. There is one piece of this skill they worked hardest to bury. It is the piece that separates the families who slept warm through every winter from the 9 trappers in the Absaroka foothills who built a perfect shelter and died inside it. We will get there. Stay with me by choice, friend. This is worth every minute. I am Silas Mercer, 7th generation on this ridge. The Mercers have held this stretch of Appalachian mountain since the 1790s, and I have not left it. My grandfather Eli raised me after my daddy died in the timber, and before he went, he made me copy every last thing he knew into a leather journal. This is me keeping that promise. The skill you are about to learn did not fade because it stopped working. It faded because the insulation companies and the heating industry and the synthetic sleeping bag manufacturers made a fortune the day your family forgot they could keep themselves warm with nothing but the ground, the trees, and the knowing. By the time we are done here, you will know what to do the night your furnace dies and the roads are impassable. You will know where to build. You will know how big to build. You will know what to put between you and the frozen ground. You will know how to shape a wall that stops the wind without stopping the air. And you will know the one piece the trappers at the Absaroka camp left out. The piece that turned their shelter from a refuge into a coffin. That is the through line, neighbor. I am not walking away from it until it is yours. Before we dig in, pull the trigger on subscribe. Not for me, because the buried skills we drag back into daylight around here, you are going to want the next one. There are 5 pieces to a shelter that keeps you alive. 5, in order. Miss any one, you sleep cold. Miss the last one, you sleep dead. Most people who try to build a survival shelter get the first 3 close enough to feel proud of themselves. The 4th is where the camping books wander off. But the fifth is the one that has been quietly cut out of every survival manual printed in the last 100 years. And it is the only piece that actually decides whether you wake up in the morning. We build to it piece by piece. So the real question is not what we forgot, friend. It is who cashed the check when we forgot it, and how you take the skill back before the next hard freeze. Piece 1. The ground. The first thing your great-grandmother knew that most survival instructors today get backwards. Where you build matters more than what you build. Most people start with the walls. Your great-grandmother started with the dirt under her feet. And she was right. Never build in a low spot. Cold air sinks. A valley floor, a ravine, a creek bottom, those are cold pools. The temperature at the bottom of a hollow can be 15 to 20 degrees colder than the slope 30 feet above it. Your great-grandmother called that the frost pocket. She did not know the thermodynamics. She knew her knees ached worse down there and her breath hung in the air longer. Same science, different language. Build on the leeward side of a ridge, 1/3 of the way down from the top, high enough to escape the cold pool, low enough to escape the wind at the crest. The ridge itself blocks the prevailing wind. You are building in the wind shadow. Never build under a standing dead tree. Never build under a limb loaded with snow. Never build on a slope steep enough to slide. Never build on ground that is already wet. Your great-grandmother checked the canopy above her head and the soil under her knees before she swung the first axe stroke. Modern survival shows skip this step and go straight to construction. They build beautiful shelters in terrible locations and wonder why the cold still finds them. The United States Army Cold Weather Training Manual, published by the Northern Warfare Training Center in Fort Wainwright, Alaska, identifies site selection as the single most important variable in field shelter survival. Not construction technique, not insulation material. Site selection. The Army figured out in the 1950s what your great-grandmother knew in the 1850s. Where you build decides whether the rest of the build matters at all. A modern 4-season expedition tent with a full rainfly and insulated footprint runs $500 to $900. Your great-grandmother's site selection, a flat spot on the leeward side of a ridge above the frost pocket, costs nothing. Same principle. You cannot buy a location. This week, walk your property or the nearest woodlot. Find the spot where the cold pools on a still night. Then walk uphill 30 feet and feel the difference. That difference is the whole first lesson. Piece 2. The shape. This is the geometry your great-grandfather understood without ever using the word. A survival shelter is not a room. It is a body sleeve. The single most common mistake people make when building a field shelter is making it too big. They build it like a room they can stand up in and walk around in, and then they spend the whole night trying to heat a volume of air their body was never designed to warm. Your body produces roughly 300 to 400 BTUs of heat per hour at rest. That is enough to raise the temperature inside a space the size of a coffin by 20 to 30 degrees above outside air. It is not enough to warm a space the size of a bedroom by even 5 degrees. The math is simple. Smaller is warmer, always. Your great-grandfather's field shelter was just wide enough to lie down with his elbows at his sides, just tall enough to sit up, just long enough from his heels to 6 inches past the crown of his head. That is it. No room to pace, no room to stand, no room to feel comfortable. Comfort is for cabins, survival is for shelters. He was not building a home, he was building a heat trap. The lean-to, the A-frame, the debris hut, the snow trench, the quingy, every traditional cold-weather shelter design in every culture that survived real winters shares one feature. The interior volume is as small as the human body allows. Your great-grandfather was not being primitive. He was being precise. A modern emergency bivy sack made of reflective mylar with a sealed zipper runs $30 to $80. Your great-grandfather's debris hut, built from deadfall branches and leaf litter in 90 minutes, traps heat the same way and insulates 40 times better. Because mylar reflects radiant heat. Leaf litter stops conductive and convective heat loss, 2 out of 3 wins, and the leaf litter is free. This weekend, measure your body, shoulder width, shoulder to heel, shoulder to top of head sitting. Write those numbers down. Those are the interior dimensions of your survival shelter. Anything bigger is a waste of heat you cannot afford to lose. Piece 3. The bed. This is the piece that separates the people who slept from the people who shivered. Your great-grandmother knew something about cold that most modern survival training gets exactly wrong. The cold that kills you does not come from the air, it comes from the ground. You lose heat to the ground through conduction up to 25 times faster than you lose heat to still air. Lie on bare frozen ground with the best sleeping bag money can buy, and you will be cold by midnight. The ground is a heat sink. It pulls warmth out of your body faster than your metabolism can replace it. Your great-grandmother did not know the word conduction. She knew that the woman who slept on pine boughs lived, and the woman who slept on bare earth did not. Same lesson. Older teacher. The frontier bed was built before the shelter was built. 4 to 6 inches of insulation between you and the ground. Minimum. Pine boughs, spruce tips, dried leaves, dried grass, cattail fluff, bark strips, anything dry, and anything that compresses slowly under your weight. The key word is dry. Wet insulation conducts heat almost as fast as bare ground. A wet bed is no bed at all. Eli taught me this when I was 9. We were out on the ridge in November, and he told me to build my bed. I grabbed a handful of leaves, laid them down an inch thick, and rolled out my blanket on top. He looked at it and said nothing. By 2 in the morning I was shaking so hard my jaw hurt. He was sleeping like the dead, 6 inches off the ground, on a pile of hemlock boughs that took him 40 minutes to cut and stack. In the morning, he pulled back his blanket and put his hand on the boughs. Warm. He put my hand on the ground where I had slept. Cold as creek stone. He said, "The ground eats first, boy. You feed it or it feeds on you." I never built a thin bed again. The insulated sleeping pad market is a $200 million industry globally. Values of 5, 6, 7 printed on the label in bright orange. Your great-grandmother's 6-inch pile of spruce tips has an R value north of 10 and costs nothing. And when it wears out, you build another one in 30 minutes. This week, go outside after dark. Sit on the bare ground for 5 minutes. Then sit on a folded blanket for 5 minutes. Then sit on a pile of dry leaves 6 inches deep. You do not need a thermometer. Your backside is the thermometer. The difference is the whole lesson. Now we have the ground chosen, the shape built small, and the bed laid thick. 3 pieces. And most people stop here. They have a shelter that looks right, feels snug, blocks the wind. And this is exactly where the trappers at the Absaroka camp stood. Walls tight, fire crackling, wind shut out. 3 pieces done, and still dying. Piece 4. The wall. This is the one the modern camping industry gets exactly backwards. And it is the reason your great-grandfather's shelter worked, and your $800 tent sometimes does not. A survival shelter wall has 2 jobs. Stop the wind, hold the heat. Most people think those are the same job. They are not. Wind is horizontal, heat is vertical. Wind moves sideways, heat rises. Your wall must block the lateral movement of air without trapping the vertical movement of air. Read that again, neighbor. because that sentence is the hinge that the whole skill turns on. Your great-grandfather built thick walls. Sod, log, stone, packed snow, stacked brush, covered in bark and leaf litter. The thicker the wall, the slower the heat bleeds through it. A 12-inch wall of packed debris loses heat roughly 4 times slower than a 3-inch wall. Thickness matters, but, and this is where the myth begins, he never sealed them perfectly. He left gaps near the top. He left the wall slightly thinner where it met the ceiling line. He never chinked the upper 6 inches the way he chinked the lower 4 feet. And that was not laziness. That was the 4th piece of the skill. The reason goes back to physics your great-grandmother felt but could not name. Warm air rises. If the warm air in your shelter has nowhere to go, it hits the ceiling, saturates with moisture from your breathing, and condenses. Condensation drips. Drips soak your bedding. Wet bedding conducts heat away from your body. You get colder, you breathe harder, you produce more moisture. The cycle accelerates. By morning, everything inside the shelter is damp, and damp kills at 40 degrees what dry survives at 20 below. A study published by the U.S. Army Research Institute of Environmental Medicine found that soldiers in sealed cold weather shelters experienced significant heat loss through moisture saturation of clothing and bedding even when ambient temperatures inside the shelter were above freezing. The conclusion: a shelter that traps moisture is more dangerous than a shelter that leaks air. Your great-grandfather knew this. That is why his walls were thick at the bottom and thin at the top. Thick to stop the wind, thin to let the wet out. This is where the shelter companies earn their margin. They sell you sealed, waterproof, windproof, draft-free, every seam taped, every zipper gasketed, and inside that perfectly sealed space, your own breath becomes the enemy. The survival blanket companies sell you mylar and call it warmth. The tent companies sell you sealed fly sheets and call it protection. What they do not sell you is the understanding that a perfectly sealed shelter in sustained cold is a moisture trap, and a moisture trap is a slow-motion hypothermia chamber. Your great-grandfather left the gaps on purpose, neighbor, and nobody taught you why, because there is no profit in a gap. Pattern break, friend. Everything so far, most experienced outdoors people know some version of, but I need you to hear me now. What comes next is the piece that divides the men who built shelters from the men who built coffins. This is where the 9 trappers in the Absaroka Range stood. Walls packed tight, moss stuffed into every crack, buffalo hide sealed over the door, fire crackling, wind silenced, and 7 of them dead by the 3rd dawn, because there is a 5th piece, and I have been building you toward it since the opening minute. This is it. Piece 5. The last piece, the one that no survival gear company puts on the label, and the one that killed the trappers at the Absaroka camp. The gap. Picture the dugout in the hillside. January in the Montana Territory. The blizzard has been blowing for 2 days. 9 men packed shoulder to shoulder in a space the size of a modern living room. They have done everything right by the standard of the myth. The walls are solid, the door is sealed, the fire is burning. No wind reaches them. They are warm, they are proud, they are dying. Here is what happened inside that shelter over 72 hours. The fire consumed oxygen. 9 men breathing consumed oxygen. In a sealed space with no air exchange, the oxygen level drops. As oxygen drops, the fire produces less heat and more carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide is colorless, odorless, tasteless. The first symptom is a headache, the second is drowsiness, the third is unconsciousness, the fourth is death. The men who felt sleepy thought they were warming up, they were shutting down. Simultaneously, 9 men breathing in a sealed space produced moisture. Each adult exhales roughly 1 pint of water vapor in 8 hours of sleep. 9 men over 3 nights is more than 13 gallons of water vapor released into a sealed dugout. That moisture condensed on the walls, on the buffalo hide, on the blankets, on the clothing. Everything inside became damp. Damp wool loses 80% of its insulating value. Damp cotton loses all of it. When the fire finally choked on its own exhaust and guttered out in the early hours of the 3rd morning, those men were lying in wet blankets, in wet clothing, in a space that was no longer being heated. The temperature inside the shelter equalized with the outside air within 2 hours, but the men were already wet, and wet skin loses heat to the air 25 times faster than dry skin. They did not freeze because the blizzard found them. They froze because their own shelter drowned them from the inside. The gap. The deliberate, intentional, never sealed opening that your great-grandfather left in every shelter he ever built. A vent hole at the peak, the size of your fist or larger. A crack where the wall meets the roof that is never chinked. A gap at the base of the door that is never plugged. Cross ventilation. Air in low, air out high. The cold air enters at the bottom, the warm air exits at the top, and in between, the cycle moves. Oxygen replenishes. Carbon monoxide vents. Moisture escapes. The air inside the shelter is 5 degrees cooler than it would be in a sealed space. And that 5-degree tax is the price of living through the night. Your great-grandmother did not understand gas exchange. She did not know the words carbon monoxide or relative humidity or dew point. She knew that the family that left a crack at the top lived, and the family that chinked every gap died. She knew it because her grandmother told her, because her grandmother's grandmother told her, because somewhere in the chain of people who kept families alive through Appalachian winters and Great Plains blizzards and Rocky Mountain whiteouts, somebody learned the lesson the way lessons get learned on the frontier. Somebody died, and the next person in line left the gap open. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention reports that carbon monoxide poisoning from heating sources in enclosed spaces remains one of the leading causes of death during winter storms and power outages in the United States to this day. The same mechanism that killed those trappers in 1846 kills Americans in sealed garages and closed rooms every winter. The technology changed. The mistake did not. The 9 trappers at the Absaroka camp did not die because of the blizzard. The blizzard was survivable. Men in open lean-tos with properly vented fires survived that same storm 50 miles south in the Yellowstone drainage. The trappers died because they believed the myth that said, tight is safe. The myth that said, seal every crack. The myth that said, the enemy is the wind. The wind was never the enemy, friend. The wind was the ventilation. And when they stopped it, they stopped the one thing keeping them alive. A modern carbon monoxide detector with a digital readout and a 10-year sealed battery runs $30 to $50. Your great-grandmother's gap at the roofline runs nothing. And hers worked when the battery was dead, when the power was out, and when the nearest store was 200 miles of frozen trail away. Because the gap does not detect the poison. The gap prevents the poison. Prevention does not need a battery. The gap, the deliberate opening that lets cold air in so that death goes out. 5 degrees of comfort traded for a lifetime of breathing. That is the 5th piece. That is the piece the trappers missed. That is the distance between a shelter and a coffin. And it is the most counterintuitive lesson in all of frontier survival. You do not survive the cold by shutting it out completely. You survive the cold by letting just enough of it in to keep the air moving. Your great-grandmother knew this in her bones. The shelter gear industry has spent a century teaching you to forget it. So here is your skill, whole and yours. Choose the ground, leeward side, above the frost pocket, below the ridgeline. Build small. Body width, Sitting height, heel to crown plus 6 inches. Lay the bed thick. 6 inches of dry material between you and the earth, minimum. Build the wall thick at the bottom, thin at the top. Block the wind, never block the air. And then, the piece the shelter companies do not print on the tag, the piece the trappers in the Absaroka Range sealed shut, you leave the gap. Fist-sized vent at the peak. Crack at the base of the door. Air in low. Air out high. That is the whole method. That is the skill your great-grandmother lived by, and the men in the Montana foothills died without. And now it is yours. The whole empire of sealed tents and taped seams and gasketed zippers was built on you not knowing the fifth piece. That is it. That is the whole trick. This was never really about a shelter or a storm, neighbor. It was about being a person who cannot be caught without knowing. If the power fails in January, your family sleeps warm. If the roads close, your family sleeps warm. If the furnace dies at 2 in the morning and the repairman cannot come until Tuesday, you shrug and you build a small space in the warmest room, insulate the floor, crack a window 1 inch at the top, and your family sleeps warm and safe and breathing. That is not survivalism. That is not doom talk. That is the ordinary competence your great-grandmother had that got quietly taken from you, that you just took back. You do not have to build a debris hut this weekend, friend. Do one thing. The next cold night, go into your yard or your nearest woodlot. Rake up a pile of dry leaves, 6 inches deep, the length of your body. Lie on it for 10 minutes. Then lie on the bare ground for 10 minutes. That difference you feel is piece 3. That is the ground eating. And once you feel it, you will never forget it. That is the whole entry ticket. Your great-grandmother knew all of this. Somebody just did not get the chance to hand it down to you. That is what I was here for tonight. Tell me down below, did your grandparents build any kind of field shelter? Did they leave a gap at the top? Did they use pine boughs, leaves, moss, or something else for bedding? Different regions built different ways, and the story that gets the most comments is the story I go deep on next. Your great-great-grandmother slept a family through a 3-day blizzard in a shelter she built with her hands. Now you know how she did it. Do not let it die on your watch. Next time, the $2 candle trick that heated a frontier cabin for an entire winter, and the year the heating oil companies made sure your grandmother forgot it existed. Keep the old ways. They kept us.